The summer of 1914 began with the sound of carriages on cobblestone streets, the quiet hum of cafe conversations, and the distant tolling of church bells. Across Europe, the air was warm and filled with the lazy optimism of a continent that believed war was a relic of the past. The great powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, were locked in a delicate balance of treaties, trade, and diplomacy. The Industrial Revolution had transformed cities into sprawling hubs of progress. Trains thundered along iron tracks, telegrams crossed continents in seconds, and factories poured smoke into skies that seemed to promise nothing but endless growth. Yet beneath this veneer of peace, fault lines ran deep. Old rivalries and imperial ambitions lay hidden, like cracks beneath fresh paint. The map of Europe was a chessboard dominated by two great alliance systems, the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. These agreements, designed to prevent war, ironically made it almost inevitable. A quarrel between two powers would not remain a quarrel. It would drag the others in like dominoes falling in sequence. In the Balkans, that restless powder keg of Europe, nationalism burned fiercely. Slavic peoples, chafing under the rule of Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, dreamed of independence. And Serbia, small but ambitious, saw itself as the champion of Slavic unity. A vision that clashed violently with Vienna's own imperial designs. On the morning of June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, rode through the streets in an open-top car with his wife, Sophie. They were there on a goodwill visit, but their very presence inflamed nationalist passions. Waiting in the crowd was Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old member of the radical group known as the Black Hand. Earlier that day, a failed bombing attempt had rattled the city, yet the Archduke, stubborn and dismissive of danger, continued his schedule. Fate, and a wrong turn by his driver brought him directly into Princip's path. Two shots cracked through the air. Franz Ferdinand and Sophie slumped in their seats, fatally wounded. The assassination was the spark, but the tinder had been laid for decades. Vienna, humiliated and enraged, saw an opportunity to crush Serbia once and for all. But in a world bound by alliances, the question was never just what will Austria do, it was what will everyone do. Austria-Hungary turned to its powerful ally, Germany, for support, receiving what would become infamous as the blank check, a promise of full backing, even if it meant war with Russia. Meanwhile, Serbia counted on Russia, the self-proclaimed protector of Slavs, for aid. The machinery of mobilization began to hum, slow at first, then with unstoppable momentum. Diplomats shuttled between capitals, telegrams flew back and forth, and for a brief moment, it seemed possible that war might still be avoided. But pride, fear, and miscalculation conspired to seal Europe's fate. On July 28, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized. Germany declared war on Russia, then on France. When German armies marched through neutral Belgium to outflank the French, Britain, bound by treaty and outraged by the violation, declared war on Germany. In just over a month, the old world had crumbled. The era of optimism was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a conflict that would draw in nations from every corner of the globe. By August, millions of men were on the move. In cities, crowds cheered as soldiers marched off to the front, believing the war would be over by Christmas. They carried shiny rifles, wore bright uniforms, and sang patriotic songs, not knowing that they were walking into a nightmare of mud, barbed wire, and relentless death. The fuse had been lit, and Europe's great powers were now hurtling toward the first industrialized slaughter in human history. By the autumn of 1914, the map of Europe had become a storm. On the Western Front, the German army advanced with clockwork precision, sweeping through Belgium and northern France in the hope of encircling Paris before the French could mount a defense. This was the famed Schlieffen Plan, a bold gamble meant to win the war in weeks, but gambles, once in motion, rarely unfold as neatly as on paper. The Belgian resistance was fiercer than expected, slowing the German advance and buying precious time for the French and British to mobilize. The world watched in disbelief as cities were shelled, civilians fled in droves, and the first great refugee crisis of the 20th century began. By early September, French and British forces made their stand along the Marne River. In a battle that lasted days, the Allies halted the German drive toward Paris. Taxis famously ferried soldiers from the city to the front, an almost surreal image of modernity and desperation colliding. The Schlieffen Plan was broken, and with it went the dream of a short war. Both sides dug in, literally, carving vast trench systems into the earth. The Western Front froze into a brutal stalemate, stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. A scar across Europe where young men would live, fight, and die for the next 4 years. Meanwhile, the Eastern Front was a war of movement and vast distances. Here, the German and Austro-Hungarian armies clashed with the massive Russian Empire. At Tannenberg in August 1914, German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff delivered a crushing defeat to the Russians, capturing tens of thousands of prisoners and halting the Tsar's early offensive. Yet the Eastern Front would remain fluid, with cities changing hands, railways destroyed, and millions displaced. This was not merely a European war anymore, it was a global conflict. Far from the muddy fields of France and Poland, battles erupted in Africa, where colonial troops fought for control of ports, railways, and resources. In Asia, Japan, allied with Britain, seized German possessions in China and the Pacific. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire, joining the Central Powers, struck at British positions in Egypt and the Suez Canal. The war's reach was unprecedented. Soldiers from India, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and across the colonies of Africa and Asia found themselves fighting in lands they had never seen before, under flags that were not their own. At sea, the conflict raged just as fiercely. The British Royal Navy's blockade of Germany sought to starve the Central Powers of food and supplies, while German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, targeting merchant and military ships alike. The age of modern naval warfare had arrived. Steel warships, long-range guns, and deadly submarines changing the rules of the game. Even the skies became a battlefield, as flimsy biplanes and zeppelins took to the air for reconnaissance, bombing, and dogfights heralding a new dimension of combat. By the end of 1914, it was clear to all that the war would not end quickly. The optimism that had sent men marching with flowers in their rifles was gone. In its place was the grim understanding that this would be a war of endurance, fought not only on the battlefield but in the factories, the fields, and the hearts of entire nations. Winter descended, the trenches filled with water and mud, and the great armies settled in for a conflict that would consume millions before its end. The Great War had truly begun, and the world would never be the same again.
By early 1915, the Western Front had hardened into a grim, unbroken chain of trenches stretching for hundreds of miles. These were not simple ditches. They were vast, complex systems, dug deep into the earth, with forward positions, reserve lines, and communication trenches twisting like veins across the landscape. Sandbags lined the parapets, wooden planks. The duckboards kept men's feet out of the worst of the mud, and barbed wire stretched in snarls across the fields between opposing sides. That wasteland between the trenches became infamous as No Man's Land, a killing zone of churned earth, shattered trees, and the corpses of men who would never be retrieved. Life here was not measured in glorious charges, but in hours, days, and months of unrelenting hardship. Soldiers lived in a world of perpetual dampness. Rain turned the ground into a sucking mire, and winter froze it solid. The stench was constant. The mingled smell of unwashed bodies, rotting food, gunpowder, and death. Rats the size of small cats roamed freely, feeding on scraps, and sometimes on the bodies of the fallen. Lice burrowed into clothing and skin, spreading the maddening itch of trench fever. And yet, amid the misery, there were moments of strange normality. Men brewed tea over small fires, played cards, wrote letters home, and swapped stories to fill the endless waiting. But waiting did not mean safety. Death came at any hour, in any form. A sniper's bullet, an artillery shell screaming from miles away, or the silent creep of poison gas drifting low across the ground. Chlorine gas, first unleashed by the Germans in 1915 at Ypres, burned the lungs and eyes, suffocating its victims. It was a new kind of horror, and soon both sides were arming themselves with masks and filters, turning the trenches into a macabre laboratory for industrialized killing. The roar of artillery was constant! Barrages that could last for days, turning entire sectors into lunar landscapes of craters and shattered bodies. When orders came to go over the top, soldiers would scramble up ladders and into no man's land, charging toward enemy positions under machine gun fire so relentless it cut down whole companies in minutes. Gains were measured not in miles, but in yards. And often, after days of bloodshed, the ground would be lost again in the next counterattack. The great offensives of 1915 and 1916 at places like Loos, Verdun, and the Somme would claim hundreds of thousands of lives without breaking the stalemate. The front lines moved so little that, in some places, the same patch of ground was fought over 4 years. And yet, for all its horror, Trench life forged bonds between soldiers that would last a lifetime. Men came from every corner of their nations. Farmers, factory workers, clerks, miners. And in the mud they became brothers. They shared food, shared danger, and often shared the fate of dying side by side. In letters home, they rarely spoke of the worst. The blood, the terror, the sound of men crying out for their mothers. Instead, they wrote about the weather, about the comrades they'd made, and about the dream of returning home when it's all over. But the war was far from over. Beyond the trenches, new fronts were opening. In the Dardanelles, where Allied forces tried and failed to break through to the Ottoman heartland. In Italy, where fresh fighting erupted against us, and in the skies, where aerial combat was becoming deadlier by the month. The Great War was expanding, swallowing more nations, more soldiers, and more lives into its insatiable hunger. And soon, events would draw even the far-off United States closer to the storm.
While the trenches of France and Belgium were locked in a brutal stalemate, the First World War was far from confined to the Western Front. Across Europe and beyond, battlefields erupted in regions most soldiers had never even heard of before the war. In Eastern Europe, the Russian Empire fought desperate campaigns against Germany and Austria-Hungary, with front lines that shifted hundreds of miles in a single season. Battles like Tannenberg in 1914 and the Gorlice Offensive in 1915 saw staggering casualties, as modern artillery and machine guns shredded armies unprepared for the scale of industrial warfare. To the south, the Ottoman Empire, drawn into the war on the side of the Central Powers, became a new and dangerous front. In 1915, British and French forces launched a daring gamble to knock the Ottomans out of the war by seizing control of the Dardanelles Strait, the narrow waterway connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. The plan was bold, a naval assault to force the straits, followed by a landing at Gallipoli. But the Ottomans, under commanders like Mustafa Kemal, the man who would later be known as Ataturk, fought with relentless determination. The beaches of Gallipoli became killing grounds, and after months of bitter fighting, the Allies withdrew in defeat. For soldiers from Australia and New Zealand, the ANZACS, Gallipoli would become a defining moment of national identity, etched in memory with equal measures of pride and grief. Meanwhile, the war was spreading to Africa, where colonial troops clashed in campaigns across German East Africa, and to the Middle East, where British forces fought through the deserts of Mesopotamia. Even the seas became battlefields. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, sinking merchant ships in a campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare. These sleek predators struck without warning, sending men, cargo, and sometimes entire passenger ships to the bottom in minutes. One such attack, the sinking of the RMS Lusitania in May 1915, killed nearly 1,200 people, including 128 Americans. Shock and outrage rippled through the United States, though the country still clung to its policy of neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson walked a delicate line, insisting that America was too proud to fight while quietly preparing the nation for the possibility of war. US industries were already supplying the Allies with weapons, ammunition, and food, and American banks were lending vast sums to Britain and France. The ties were growing, economic, cultural, and political, but so too was the resistance among many Americans who wanted no part in the slaughter consuming Europe. Yet the war itself had no intention of respecting America's distance. By 1916, the Western Front erupted in two of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, Verdun and the Somme, where over 1 million men were killed or wounded in less than a year. The scale of destruction was almost beyond comprehension. In the East, the Russian Empire began to falter, its people suffering under shortages, defeats, and political unrest. A storm was brewing there that would soon explode into revolution. And in the Atlantic, Germany made a fateful decision. Desperate to starve Britain into submission, it would once again unleash unrestricted submarine warfare, gambling that the U-boats could win the war before America could enter it. But this gamble would set in motion a chain of events that would bring the United States into the fight, and tip the balance of the entire conflict. The year was 1917, and the Great War had raged for nearly 3 years. Europe was exhausted. Millions lay dead, and millions more maimed, displaced, or widowed. The Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, still held vast territories. But their enemies, the Allies, refused to yield. The Western Front remained locked in stalemate, a vast graveyard of mud and wire. In the East, the Russian Empire teetered on the brink of collapse, its people weary of endless war and scarcity. And across the Atlantic, the United States still stood apart, watching from a distance. But not for much longer. Germany's decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917 was the spark that set everything in motion. No longer would U-boats spare neutral ships or give warnings before attacks. Any vessel approaching Britain or France was a target. It was a calculated risk. Germany knew the policy would anger the United States, but they believed they could starve Britain into surrender before American troops could cross the ocean. Within weeks, U-boats sank American ships, their crews drowning in icy waters, their cargoes vanishing beneath the waves. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, a secret message from Germany's foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to Mexico. In it, Germany promised Mexico the return of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico if it joined the Central Powers in the event of war with the United States. British intelligence intercepted and decoded the telegram, passing it to Washington. When the American public learned of Germany's offer, outrage swept the nation. The image of German intrigue, plotting to carve up U.S. territory, shattered the last remnants of isolationist resolve. On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress and declared that the world must be made safe for democracy. 4 days later, the United States was officially at war. The decision was momentous. America had a small standing army, fewer than 200,000 men, but its industrial power was unmatched. If the country could mobilize, it could tip the scales decisively in favor of the Allies. Mobilization was a staggering effort. The Selective Service Act drafted millions of young men. Factories roared to life, producing rifles, artillery, uniforms, and the all-important Liberty ships that would carry soldiers and supplies across the Atlantic. Women filled industrial jobs left vacant by men, while farmers worked to feed not just America, but also Britain, France, and their armies. The country's culture shifted almost overnight. Propaganda posters urged citizens to conserve food, buy war bonds, and remain vigilant against spies and saboteurs. Meanwhile, the battlefields of Europe awaited. In 1917, the Allies were in a precarious position. France had suffered near mutinies after years of catastrophic losses. Britain was stretched thin, fighting on land, at sea, and in the skies, and Russia, once the giant of the Eastern Front, was imploding. The February Revolution toppled Tsar Nicholas II, and by the year's end, the Bolsheviks seized power and pulled Russia from the war entirely through the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. This freed German forces to concentrate on the Western Front, setting the stage for one final, massive push. In the summer of 1917, the first American troops, the American Expeditionary Forces under General John J. Pershing, arrived in France. At first, they were too few to make an immediate impact, but their presence was a promise. More were coming. By mid-1918, over 2 million Americans would be in Europe, bringing fresh energy, supplies, and morale to an Allied cause that had nearly reached its breaking point. For Germany, time was running out. The U-boats had failed to starve Britain, and America's industrial might was now aligned against them. The war that had begun as a quick march to victory in 1914 had turned into a desperate struggle for survival, and soon, the final phase of the conflict, the massive offensives of 1918, would begin, deciding the fate of nations. By the summer of 1940, the world seemed engulfed in a maelstrom as the Axis powers surged forward with terrifying momentum, their ambitions and military innovations threatening to redraw the map of the globe. Germany's Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, tactics had revolutionized modern combat, combining rapid coordinated assaults by armored panzer divisions, dive bombing, Luftwaffe squadrons, and swift infantry to overwhelm enemies before they could mount effective resistance. This new form of warfare shattered the illusions of static, trench-bound conflict that had dominated the First World War and ushered in a terrifying era of rapid conquest and upheaval. In May of that year, the German Wehrmacht executed a daring and unexpected maneuver through the Ardennes forest terrain. The Allies had deemed impenetrable, bypassing the heavily fortified Maginot Line that guarded France's eastern border. Within days, German forces swept through Belgium and northern France, encircling and capturing vast numbers of Allied troops in a lightning-fast campaign that culminated with the fall of Paris on June 14, 1940. France's swift surrender stunned the world and left Britain isolated and vulnerable, forced to stand alone against the Axis juggernaut. Yet the British people, led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill's unyielding resolve, refused to yield. From July through October, the skies above southern England became the stage for the Battle of Britain, the first major campaign waged entirely by air forces. The German Luftwaffe sought to destroy Britain's air defenses, industrial centers, and morale through relentless bombing raids, known as the Blitz, striking cities like London with devastating force in the hope of forcing a British capitulation or clearing the way for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But the Royal Air Force, though outnumbered, leveraged cutting-edge radar technology, and employed innovative tactics with fierce determination, repelling wave after wave of German bombers and fighters in a conflict that tested courage and endurance on both sides. The failure of the Luftwaffe to achieve air superiority forced Hitler to postpone, and then abandon the invasion plans, marking a crucial turning point and delivering a vital psychological boost to the Allied cause. Meanwhile, the war spread beyond Europe's borders as Axis powers sought to expand their spheres of influence. In North Africa, Italy's attempts to seize control of Egypt and the Suez Canal, a vital artery for Allied shipping, had initially faltered, prompting Germany to send its legendary commander Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps to bolster Axis forces. What followed was a brutal, mobile desert war fought over scorching sands and vital supply routes, with both Axis and Allied forces engaging in daring offensives, fierce counterattacks, and precarious retreats. Control of North Africa was not only strategic for Mediterranean dominance, but also critical for access to Middle Eastern oil, a resource increasingly vital for sustaining the war effort. Simultaneously, in East Asia and the Pacific, Japan pursued its imperial ambitions with brutal efficiency. Having occupied Manchuria since 1931 and waging a protracted, devastating war against China since 1937, as Japan sought to secure resources like oil, rubber, and minerals, tensions with Western colonial powers escalated, leading to embargoes that threatened Japan's war machine. Believing that war with the United States and its allies was inevitable, Japan prepared for a decisive strike to secure its dominance over the Pacific. On the morning of December 7, 1941, this plan culminated in a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In a meticulously coordinated assault, waves of Japanese carrier-based aircraft targeted battleships, cruisers, airfields, and support vessels, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans. The attack was intended to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and delay American intervention, buying Japan time to consolidate its new empire. Instead, it galvanized the United States, transforming it overnight from a nation torn by isolationism and debate into a fully engaged combatant. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's impassioned speech to Congress declared the attack a date which will live in infamy, and within days, America declared war on Japan. In a swift response, Germany and Italy honored their Axis commitments by declaring war on the United States, plunging the conflict into a truly global war. The seemingly unstoppable Axis powers had reached the height of their territorial control and military power, but the entry of the United States, with its vast industrial base and manpower, marked the beginning of a profound shift in the war's trajectory. The coming years would test the limits of endurance, courage, and sacrifice on all sides, as the Allies rallied to push back against Axis aggression and change the course of history forever. By the closing months of 1942 and into 1943, the brutal landscape of the Second World War began to change as a series of fierce, determined counteroffensives by the Allied powers began to erode the once unstoppable advance of the Axis. This period marked a profound turning point, shifting the momentum from the seemingly invincible Axis forces to a new phase of grueling attrition warfare, where endurance, resilience, and industrial might would decide the fate of nations. The Eastern Front, stretching thousands of miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, became the brutal heart of this struggle, where the Soviet Union endured some of the war's most horrific battles and demonstrated an unyielding will to resist and reclaim lost ground. The battle that perhaps most starkly embodied this shift was the Battle of Stalingrad, a grueling siege that unfolded from August 1942 through February 1943. Stalingrad, a key industrial city on the Volga River, was more than a strategic prize, it was a symbol. Adolf Hitler obsessed over capturing it, partly for its name bearing that of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and partly for its vital position controlling transport routes. The German Sixth Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, launched a massive assault with air bombardments that turned much of the city into rubble, but the Soviet defenders, led by generals like Vasily Chukov, held their ground with brutal tenacity. Street by street, building by building, the fighting descended into savage close-quarters combat, where snipers, engineers, and infantrymen battled in the ruins. The Soviets used the devastated urban terrain to their advantage, setting ambushes and counterattacks that slowly wore down the Germans. Meanwhile, the Soviets were preparing a bold and risky plan to encircle and trap the German forces. Operation Uranus, launched in November 1942, aimed to strike at the weaker Romanian and Hungarian units, guarding the flanks of the German army. The operation succeeded spectacularly, surrounding the Sixth Army in a cauldron with no easy way out. Despite Hitler's orders forbidding retreat, and promises of relief that never came, the German troops were trapped through a brutal winter. Starvation, disease, and relentless Soviet attacks wore down their morale and strength. Finally, in February 1943, Paulus surrendered, marking one of the most devastating defeats in German military history. The fall of Stalingrad shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility, boosted Soviet morale immensely, and marked the beginning of a powerful Soviet westward push that would continue relentlessly to the war's end. Almost immediately after, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 reinforced this changing tide. It was the largest tank battle in history, a massive clash in the steppes of western Russia, where the Germans sought to regain the initiative with a surprise attack. Yet the Soviets, having learned from past mistakes, constructed deep-layered defenses with extensive minefields, anti-tank guns, and well-coordinated infantry and air support. The German offensive, Operation Citadel, initially made some progress but was halted by fierce resistance. Soviet counteroffensives then exploited German weaknesses, launching their own massive attacks that pushed the Wehrmacht into full retreat. Kursk marked not just a military victory, but a psychological shift. From this point forward, the Red Army held the strategic initiative in the east, forcing the Germans onto the defensive for the remainder of the war. While the Eastern Front absorbed much of the war's ferocity, the deserts of North Africa were another critical arena where the Axis expansionist ambitions began to falter. The North African campaign had started with Italy's failed attempts to seize Egypt and control the Suez Canal, a vital artery for Allied supply lines and Middle Eastern oil. Recognizing the faltering Italian effort, Germany sent the charismatic and cunning General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, to support Axis operations. Rommel's Africa Corps swiftly pushed British and Commonwealth forces back across Libya, capturing the key port of Tobruk and threatening the vital supply lines of the Allies. The campaign evolved into a high-stakes chess match across vast deserts, punctuated by intense tank battles, daring raids, and struggles for key terrain such as the fortified town of El Am. The harsh environment, with its extreme heat, sandstorms, and logistical challenges, tested both sides' endurance and adaptability. However, by late 1942, the tide shifted with the arrival of fresh Allied forces and improved coordination. Under the command of British General Bernard Montgomery, the Allied forces launched a decisive offensive at the Second Battle of El Alamein. With superior numbers, intelligence, and logistics, Montgomery's forces broke through Rommel's defenses, forcing a retreat that would continue until the Axis powers were entirely expelled from North Africa in May 1943. This victory secured the Suez Canal for the Allies, safeguarded oil supplies, and paved the way for the next phase of the war. The invasion of Italy. The Italian campaign began in July 1943, with Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. This amphibious and airborne assault was one of the largest of its kind, and met with fierce but ultimately unsuccessful resistance. The fall of Sicily precipitated the collapse of Benito Mussolini's fascist regime and his arrest. The new Italian government, under Marshal Pietro Badoglio, negotiated an armistice with the Allies, but German forces quickly moved to occupy northern and central Italy, turning the peninsula into a brutal battleground of attritional warfare. The Allies faced heavily fortified German defensive lines, including the formidable Gustav Line anchored by the mountain fortress of Monte Cassino. The campaign was characterized by slow progress, heavy casualties, and bitter fighting in challenging terrain, underscoring the complexity of the war beyond large-scale mechanized battles. Farther east, the Pacific theater saw some of the war's most dramatic shifts during this period, as the United States and its allies mounted a determined campaign to halt and then roll back Japanese expansion. Following the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Japanese quickly seized vast territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, threatening Australia and disrupting Allied supply chains. However, 1942 brought critical victories that altered the strategic landscape. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a stunning blow to the Japanese Navy. Thanks to the efforts of American codebreakers who deciphered Japanese plans, U.S. forces ambushed and sank for Japanese aircraft carriers, crippling Japan's offensive capabilities and shifting naval superiority in the Pacific toward the Allies. Following Midway, the struggle shifted to the islands of the Pacific, where fierce and often brutal battles tested the resolve and ingenuity of both sides. The Guadalcanal campaign, beginning in August 1942, was the first major Allied offensive against Japanese-held territory. US Marines, supported by the Navy and Air Forces, fought grueling jungle warfare against determined Japanese defenders, with intense close-quarter combat, disease, and supply challenges compounding the difficulties. The campaign lasted 6 months and ended with the Japanese evacuation, marking the first major land defeat for Japan and signaling a shift from defensive to offensive operations for the Allies. Building on these successes, the Allies adopted a strategy known as island hopping, selectively targeting key islands to capture airfields and naval bases, bypassing heavily fortified Japanese positions. This approach allowed them to steadily advance toward Japan while conserving resources and manpower. Battles such as those on Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu were marked by fierce fighting and heavy casualties, but paved the way for the eventual assault on the Japanese home islands. Simultaneously, U.S. forces in the Pacific began to dominate sea and air control, further isolating Japanese garrisons and cutting off vital supply lines. Throughout this period, the Allied war effort was bolstered by extraordinary industrial capacity and technological innovation, particularly by the United States. Factories operated around the clock, producing vast quantities of weapons, vehicles, ships, and aircraft. Advances in radar, cryptography, and logistics dramatically enhanced Allied effectiveness. The coordination among the Allies through bodies, like the Combined Chiefs of Staff, and conferences such as Casablanca and Terra Now Loud for strategic planning that synchronized efforts across multiple theaters, maximizing pressure on Axis forces worldwide. Despite these successes, the cost was immense. Battles were often prolonged, with staggering casualties and profound suffering among soldiers and civilians alike. The war's totalizing nature demanded sacrifices on a scale unseen before, testing the resilience and resolve of entire nations. Yet the growing strength and unity of the Allies signaled that the Axis powers' grip on their conquered territories was slipping, and a long-awaited victory was within reach. As 1943 turned toward 1944, the momentum firmly in Allied hands. The stage was set for the next phase of the war: the liberation of Western Europe, the final collapse of Axis resistance in Italy, and the relentless push toward Japan's doorstep in the Pacific. The tide had turned, but the fight for victory and the price it would exact was far from over. By the summer of 1944, the Allied forces, having built up massive strength and experience, prepared to open the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe, a decisive strike that would finally shatter Nazi Germany's grip on the continent. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord began with the largest amphibious invasion in history: the D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy, France. Over 156,000 Allied troops, primarily Americans, British, and Canadians, crossed the English Channel in a meticulously coordinated assault involving thousands of ships, planes, and paratroopers. The operation was a monumental gamble, fraught with uncertainty and danger, as German defenses, known as the Atlantic Wall, stretched along the coast with fortifications, mines, and artillery. The invasion began before dawn, with airborne units dropping behind enemy lines to seize key bridges and disrupt communications. At dawn, waves of infantry and armored units stormed the 5 designated beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, especially on Omaha Beach, where strong German resistance inflicted heavy casualties. Yet the sheer weight of Allied firepower, combined with air superiority and the element of surprise, gradually overwhelmed the defenders. By the end of the day, a precarious foothold was secured, enabling a steady flow of troops and supplies ashore. Over the following weeks, the Allies battled inland through the hedgerows of Normandy, facing fierce German counterattacks in bitter close-quarter combat. The Bocage country's thick vegetation and maze-like fields turned each advance into a deadly struggle. Despite the difficulties, the Allies' numerical and material superiority, combined with coordinated air and artillery support, slowly broke through. By late July, the breakout from Normandy was underway, and the rapid advance across France began. In August 1944, Paris was liberated by the French resistance and Allied forces, rekindling hope across a continent long under Nazi shadow. As the Allies pushed eastward, Germany's situation deteriorated. The Soviet Red Army, meanwhile, was advancing with relentless force from the east, having reclaimed vast territories and driven deep into Eastern Europe. The pace of their advance was staggering, fueled by momentum from earlier victories at Stalingrad and Kursk and the strategic imperative to press toward Berlin. Throughout the autumn of 1944 and winter of 1945, the Western Allies continued their push into Germany. They encountered desperate and fanatical resistance as German forces fought to defend their homeland. But the overwhelming power of Allied combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, and air support gradually wore down defenses. Supply lines and infrastructure crumbled under constant bombardment, weakening the German war machine. One of the last major German offensives came in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. Launched in the dense Ardennes forest, this surprise attack aimed to split the Allied lines and recapture the vital port of Antwerp, threatening to reverse the Allied advance. The initial German assault created a bulge in the front line, causing confusion and panic. However, stiff resistance from American units, including the heroic defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division, and rapid reinforcements eventually blunted the offensive. Bitter cold and lack of supplies further hampered German efforts. And by late January 1945, the Allies had regained lost ground. The Battle of the Bulge exhausted Germany's remaining reserves and hastened the final collapse. In the east, the Soviet juggernaut pressed onward through Poland, Hungary, and into Czechoslovakia. The Red Army's advance was marked by fierce urban combat, massive artillery barrages, and harrowing street fighting. The city of Warsaw endured a brutal uprising in 1944, crushed by German forces, while Soviet forces cautiously awaited the opportunity to enter the ruins. By April 1945, the Soviets had encircled Berlin, initiating one of the most intense battles of the war. Soviet troops fought through rubble-strewn streets, facing bitter German resistance from regular forces, SS units, and Volkssturm militias desperate to defend the capital. The fight was costly and merciless, culminating in the suicide of Adolf Hitler on April 30, 1945, as Soviet soldiers closed in on the Reichstag. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945, marking the official end of the war in Europe. Victory in Europe Day VE Day was celebrated worldwide, yet the war in the Pacific raged on. Across the vast Pacific Ocean, the United States and its allies pursued a relentless campaign of island hopping, tightening the noose around Japan. By 1944, American forces had liberated key islands such as Guam, Saipan, and Peleliu, establishing airbases that allowed for strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 was the largest naval engagement of the war, decisively crippling the Japanese Navy and severing supply lines to occupied territories. In early 1945, the U.S. launched invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, to heavily fortified islands, critical for staging an invasion of Japan. The battles were among the bloodiest of the Pacific War, with intense kamikaze attacks and fierce Japanese resistance resulting in heavy casualties on both sides. The capture of Okinawa, in particular, brought American forces within striking distance of the Japanese mainland, but also foreshadowed the horrific cost any full invasion would exact. With the prospect of a prolonged and costly invasion looming, U.S. leadership faced a grave decision. In July 1945, after the successful Trinity test of the atomic bomb in New Mexico, President Harry Truman authorized the use of atomic weapons against Japan. In August, the U.S. dropped atomic bombs on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, devastating both and causing unprecedented destruction and loss of life. Faced with this new and terrifying weapon, coupled with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan and invasion of Manchuria, Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, bringing World War II to a close. The formal signing took place aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. The fall of the Axis powers marked the end of one of history's deadliest conflicts, a war that reshaped borders, governments, and societies on a global scale. The victory was hard-won and came at a staggering human cost. Tens of millions of military and civilian lives lost, cities and landscapes ravaged, and deep scars left on the collective psyche of humanity. But it also laid the foundation for a new world order, characterized by alliances such as NATO, the creation of the United Nations, and the beginnings of the Cold War rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. This chapter in history serves as a testament to both the resilience and tragedy of humankind, a reminder of the horrors of war and the enduring hope for peace. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world emerged into a landscape scarred not only by the devastation of battlefields, but by the moral, political, and social upheavals that the Second World War had unleashed. Entire cities lay in ruins. From the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin and Warsaw to the skeletal remains of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and tens of millions were dead. The war had been fought on an unprecedented scale, consuming resources, destroying industries, and displacing entire populations. For survivors, the relief of peace was tempered by grief, hunger, and uncertainty. In Europe, millions of refugees wandered the shattered continent, searching for lost family members or a place to rebuild their lives. Prisoners of war, forced laborers, and survivors of concentration camps emerged into a world where the sheer scale of human suffering defied comprehension. The Holocaust, with its 6 million Jewish victims and millions more murdered for their ethnicity, religion, politics, or disabilities, became a grim benchmark of humanity's capacity for cruelty. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, sought to bring Nazi leaders to justice, establishing for the first time in history the principle that individuals, not just states, could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. In Asia, the devastation was equally profound. Japan's surrender, formalized aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, ended years of brutal warfare, but left the nation under US occupation, its cities burned, its economy shattered, and its people facing acute shortages of food and shelter. Across China and Southeast Asia, the power vacuum left by the retreat of Japanese forces ignited new conflicts. As colonial powers sought to reclaim territories and nationalist movements pressed for independence, the war's end did not mean an end to fighting. Rather, it marked a pivot into a new era of ideological and geopolitical struggle. Economically, the world was in tatters. Infrastructure had to be rebuilt from the ground up, and industries retooled from wartime production to civilian needs. The United States, spared the physical destruction suffered by Europe and Asia, emerged as the world's dominant economic power, possessing the majority of the planet's industrial capacity and holding vast reserves of gold. In contrast, Britain, though on the victorious side, was financially exhausted, burdened with debt and the costs of maintaining a crumbling empire. The Soviet Union, though victorious and territorially expanded, had paid a staggering price in human life and material loss. Politically, the end of the war saw the dawn of a new global order. The United Nations was established in October 1945, designed to succeed where the League of Nations had failed, to provide a forum for resolving disputes, promoting human rights, and coordinating humanitarian efforts. The UN Charter reflected the hard lessons of the previous decades, embedding commitments to collective security and the rejection of aggression. Yet from its very inception, the UN was shadowed by the emerging rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. The wartime alliance that had defeated Hitler and Japan quickly unraveled, as ideological differences hardened into mutual suspicion and strategic competition. The Cold War was already stirring in the ashes of the Second World War. The human legacy of the war extended beyond the geopolitical, technological, and scientific advances. Radar, jet engines, antibiotics, nuclear power had been accelerated by the pressures of global conflict, promising both new possibilities and new dangers. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had demonstrated that humanity now possessed the means to destroy itself in a matter of moments, forcing political leaders and ordinary citizens alike to grapple with the ethical implications of this new reality. The horrors of the Holocaust and other wartime atrocities prompted the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. As nations sought to enshrine protections against the abuses that had scarred the previous decade, for ordinary people, the war's legacy was deeply personal. It was carried in the memories of soldiers who had seen the worst of human nature, in the resilience of civilians who had endured occupation and bombing raids, and in the empty chairs at countless family tables. In many countries, the war acted as a catalyst for social change. Women who had entered the workforce in vast numbers now pushed for greater equality. Colonial subjects who had fought and died in the name of freedom demanded the same rights for themselves. And the movement for racial justice gained new urgency in the United States, where the contradiction between fighting fascism abroad and tolerating segregation at home could no longer be ignored. By the late 1940s, the world had been irrevocably transformed. Two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, stood astride a globe divided into competing spheres of influence. Former imperial powers, like Britain, France, and the Netherlands, found themselves increasingly challenged by nationalist movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The old European-dominated world order had been swept away, replaced by a bipolar struggle that would define global politics for the next half-century. The Second World War had not only redrawn borders and toppled regimes, it had reshaped the very framework of international relations, leaving behind a complex legacy of hope, fear, and hard-won lessons. The First and Second World Wars, together, had consumed just over 30 years of the 20th century, but their impact would echo far beyond it. They had demonstrated the heights of human ingenuity and cooperation, and the depths of brutality and destruction. They had ended empires, birthed new nations, and ushered in technologies and ideas that would shape the modern age. Above all, they had left behind a warning that peace is fragile, that freedom is never guaranteed, and that the costs of global conflict are borne not only in the rubble of cities and the ledgers of nations, but in the quiet grief of millions of lives forever changed. The world wars were among humanity's darkest hours, moments when the world was pushed to the brink of devastation and beyond. Yet from that darkness emerged lessons that still resonate today. They remind us that peace is precious, hard-won, and never to be taken for granted. The treaties, alliances, and ideologies that led to such massive conflicts teach us the dangers of unchecked nationalism, aggressive expansion, and the failure of diplomacy. They warn us against hatred, intolerance, and the dehumanization of others. But beyond politics and power, these wars are a story of human resilience. The ordinary people who endured unimaginable hardship, who refused to lose hope amid the rubble, and who rebuilt societies from the ashes. Their courage and sacrifice call on us to remember. To honor their memories not just with monuments and history books, but with vigilance and compassion. As we look at the challenges facing the world today, conflicts, divisions, and the threats posed by new technologies, the shadow of the world wars remains a powerful reminder. It is a call to act, to work toward understanding, cooperation, and peace, to recognize that the choices we make matter, and that the future depends on what we learn from the past. So let us remember, not only the wars themselves, but the human stories behind them, and the responsibility we share to build a better world, one that truly honors the hard lessons of history. Now, I invite you to reflect on these lessons with me. How can we, as individuals and communities, contribute to peace in our time? What stories of courage and resilience inspire you to make a difference? Share your thoughts, your questions, and your hopes. Because remembering history means shaping the future. Together, we can ensure that the sacrifices of the past lead to a more peaceful tomorrow.